Hi guys, Moji, Liz, and Marie here. We are the feminist buzzkills of Abortion Access Front, and this is the second part series that we are doing, really breaking down overall healthcare, especially reproductive care within our prison industrial complex. Last week we had an incredible conversation around overall healthcare, reproductive care, and pregnancy care when you're incarcerated. And this week we're going to dive into abortion care, whether you are someone who's incarcerated, whether you are an undocumented person who is in a detention center. So please, without further ado, she is a professor at UC Irvine. She has an incredible podcast on the issues with Michele Goodwin that is with Ms. Magazine, and her book is a must read on reproductive justice called Policing the Womb. Let's bring on Dr. Goodwin.
Well, this week there was media attention surrounding this topic because in Nebraska, the ACLU had to step in when a Nebraska Department of Correctional Services denied a person that they were holding their legal right to abortion care. And the only reason we heard about this was because it was reported, thankfully, because this person was able to get care within the state of Nebraska. But it was noted that they were facing barriers for the cost of the abortion, for the transport of the abortion, because, of course, why would, and this goes back to other legislation like the Hyde Act, why on earth should U.S. federal funds, transport someone to medical care? So all of these things were wrapped up in this. If you're pregnant and you are being held and you need an abortion, does someone always have to fight for care like this? And are there states that have better track records that you found within your research for incarcerated folks who are pregnant and need abortions?
So with regard to the Nebraska case, you're right. The ACLU had to step in. Scout Rickards, who works with the ACLU of Nebraska, said that state officials were barring a woman there from getting an abortion and forcing her to remain pregnant against her will. And this is not unusual. This has happened in other states. The state of California has a reproductive privacy written into its constitution. And so the state of California has been unique in that way. New York has now taken similar measures, and there are other states that are looking to enact progressive measures that instantiate this right of privacy into the Constitution, particularly given the very conservative movements that we see amongst senators in the United States Congress, and also what we see at the state level with the dramatic rise in what are called TRAP laws, these targeted regulations of abortion providers. And so in so many states, because of this dramatic uptick in anti-abortion legislating, I mean, between 2010 and 2013, there were more anti-abortion laws that were proposed and enacted than in the 30 years prior combined. This was part of the rise of the Tea Party. And so with that kind of aggressive movement, and it hasn't stopped, and we see the shifting nature of our courts and also our Supreme Court. And so that kind of sets the backdrop. So a state like California, better. A state like Nebraska, terrible. A state like Mississippi, terrible. A state like Louisiana, terrible. And we could go, down the list in that regard. And thank goodness that the ACLU stepped in.
Dr. Goodwin, I was also wondering too, as we see these intersections between anti-abortion extremists, white supremacy, law enforcement, people who work within the prison system, and seeing Christian extremism intersecting there. My question is are you seeing a dovetail within people who are just ignoring the law? Because I do believe that if you need an abortion, no matter what state you're in and you are incarcerated, you are entitled to have an abortion under the law of that state. So are some of these people who are working within the system, who are part of all of those horrible movements and who couldn't wait to deny someone access to abortion, just like ignoring that person's requests?
Yes. I mean, to simply put it quite simply, that's absolutely what's happening. That's what happened in this Nebraska case, and that's what's happened in other cases. We've seen that during the Trump administration with the ACLU needing to step in involving teenage girls who were in detention centers who wanted to end their pregnancies. In cases that went up before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and the DC Circuit Court of Appeals making it clear to the Trump administration that they could not deny the right to terminate a pregnancy from a person who happens to be in a detention center who is asking for it and following state protocol. So that even in these states where they have these laws that might try to restrict abortion based on the number of weeks pregnant or by other kinds of hurdles that one must overcome, you overcome those hurdles, you still are entitled to your right to terminate a pregnancy. It is a constitutional right in the United States. Roe
And,
v. Wade has not been overturned, neither
and I,
Planned Parenthood v. Casey.
and I was so frustrated because I don't know what the opposite of a fun fact is. Horrifying fact. Horrifying fact is in the case that you talked about in that Jane Doe case of the undocumented person, the judge that wrote the dissenting opinion in that case was
Is now
Brett
the Supreme Court.
Kavanaugh. And I remember I'm on the board of Whole Women's Health Alliance, and they provided the abortion for Jane Doe. And I remember that happening. And I remember Susan Collins saying, I talked to Brett Kavanaugh and he doesn't have any. And it's like, you didn't need to talk to Brett Kavanaugh. There's a ruling on the books, ma'am. Look, what is wrong with you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he wrote a book chapter on it. He's
Yes. Yes. No, I mean, you are absolutely right. And what's interesting is how clear that opinion was, that majority opinion was, and then how unmoored to law was his dissenting opinion. And that is really important to know, so that many of those who have taken these stances to thwart the ability for someone to be able to terminate a pregnancy, they're doing so not based on law, right? I mean, that is not what's coming through, but instead what you see are personal predilections and also a lack of clear legal analysis as driving these opinions when you see them coming from certain jurists, like seeing that from Kavanaugh in that particular dissent. It wasn't rooted in law, and the majority pointed that out.
Yeah.
Where does one go with that?
Oh, I know. Well, one thing I was going to say is, you brought up Jane Doe, this undocumented person from Central America who needed an abortion, was in detention. Can you walk somebody through how somebody who we know that she didn't speak English? We sent these supportive postcards written in Spanish. We did a campaign just to support her. Can you walk us through how she found advocates?
Well, that's a really good question because it's hard. First of all, thank goodness for the organizations that have held themselves out to support individuals who are attempting to immigrate under some of the most dire circumstances, and the organizations that are also looking out for people who've become pregnant who want to be able to terminate their pregnancies, and that are providing the funding and the sourcing to be able to do that. And that's critically important. And so, I mean, she wasn't able to do this just on her own. There were advocates that stood up and that helped her to navigate the legal system. And the ACLU played a critical role. Brigitte Amiri was absolutely great in leading those efforts. She was really, really terrific in that regard. And I think the biggest point that you make is one that, although in her case, it got attention and she was able to navigate the legal system because of a kind of strong organization such as the ACLU being able to support her and take her case, there are yet so many other young people, so many women who do not actually receive that level of support because people may not know about the kinds of circumstances that they're experiencing, and that they need these kinds of healthcare services. And so I think that that's part of the real tragedy. One sees a victory in that particular case, but at the same time, there's so many others who suffer in silence and are invisible.
Yeah, I mean, how many records do we have of people? How do we don't know, and when you look into, and I'll put a link in our YouTube for this. When you look into Scott Lloyd, who was part of the Health and Human Services Department, who set up the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who set up the kids in cages and whose only experience has been to be a vaginal crossing guard for anybody. He was himself going and monitoring the menstrual cycles of the incarcerated girls. And he is somebody who, when she said, I want an abortion, brought her to a crisis pregnancy center and had people pray over her. I mean, it is profound, this list that he personally kept, trying
That's
to
right.
figure out how many of these undocumented people were pregnant and trying to keep them pregnant. It's appalling. And when you go, in fact, I want to put a link to Brigitte and Amiri interviewing him, because it is one of the most incredible interrogations of a soulless monster by somebody with incredible compassion that I've ever witnessed.
Well, the other issue that you're pointing out is this level of surveillance. And this is something that has deeply concerned me. So, when I began looking at the criminalization associated with pregnancy, which we could call the new Jane Crow, and here just a shout out to Polly Murray, who was writing about this, a fabulous queer Black woman who had been writing about the intersectional harms of race and sex back in the 1930s and 40s. And fortunately, she's just beginning to get her due. But when one looks at these practices of criminalization, the state surveillance intensified during the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. The sort of perfect coming together of the kind of war on drugs, which also was a war on poor women. And this kind of morphed into, let's create the sort of fictionalized character of the crack mom. And then let's tell stories about her crack baby who will never be educable, never be able to hold down a job, and will be ultimately criminal. And let's now use that as the backdrop for going after Black and brown women. States like Wisconsin enacting laws euphemistically called the crack baby mama law, which provided for civil incarceration to protect the fetus, with no protection for a woman to be able to have a lawyer at all, but lawyers being appointed for fetuses. You have, states that created special ways to shackle pregnant women, right? As if regular shackling wasn't enough, but black box shackling, because we're going to shackle your ankles, shackle your wrist, shackle your wrists, and then we're going to create a shackle around your growing womb as well. Like, you can't even make that up. Like, who sits in an office one day saying, like, we're going to create this special way to provide this extra legal punishment against these women? But this expansion of incarceration and the narrative behind it, right? That we've got to yank these women out of society, and that these women, while they're in society, are welfare queens, right? So you got like the welfare queen myth marrying up against the crack mama, myth, and then these horrible things being said about their kids. And it just led to a level of surveillance, right? In the state of South Carolina, yeah, prosecutors there was who are on record saying that, look, I could use the carrot or I could use the stick, but I'm using the stick against these women. I mean, there are stories of Black women being dragged out of hospitals, shackled and chained in bloodied gowns, having just given birth. Women who thought that they could trust their medical providers and could tell a story about, this is my life. I was raped. I'm now pregnant. Yeah, I don't have insurance, and I took a drug just to, like, deal with my pain and anxiety, having no idea that by sharing that with a nurse or doctor, that it would be turned over to local prosecutors who are more than happy to use these women as an example of their ability to be tough on crime. So this is the backdrop that leads us to where we are today, and Garza v. Harrigan, the case that we were talking about, and so many others. So
Yeah,
that's
it's
part
true.
of the
And
horror.
Mochi's going to wrap us up. But the one thing I just wanted to say, Moch, before I turn it over to you, is everything Michele was just talking about reminds me of something that we can't say enough, is that this crosses political parties. This was
Yeah.
escalating during Bill Clinton. It was exacerbated by Bill Clinton. And you cannot say enough if you've read Michelle Alexander's book, and you will learn these things. But like, it was the respectability politics of the centrist Democratic Party that really led the way on this on this very thing that Michelle's talking about. So
Dr. Goodwin, thank you so much for joining us. This was incredibly informative. This was a subject that we wanted to address a week or two ago. We're like, we can't do this alone. We need an expert, and it's so great of you to step in and be our expert. How can our viewers and listeners become involved in the reproductive justice fight for detained and incarcerated communities? Is there any link or anything any information you can give that can help our listeners really like step in and like fight for people?
Sylvia Law has been doing great work in this domain, and so I would definitely say follow her on Twitter, follow her work. She's been an advocate because her sister was incarcerated. She's been doing great writing within this space. And I would also say, support organizations like yours. I mean, the fact that we're able to lift this up here today is critically important, and there are not enough organizations that are doing this work. But I would also say there's a great documentary that's recently come out, and they have wonderful tools on their website for people to know about, and that's Belly of the Beast, which is looking at another end of this, which is coercive sterilization behind bars. So let's, level set and see the full picture. And I'm just so happy to be with you and looking forward to coming back, and we can do more of this.
Yes,
For my favorite person, Liz.
Too. I mean, you break it down so profoundly with clarity and also with such great humanity. I think the thing that makes change is storytelling and putting human face on what people go through and contextualizing. I mean, we just saw this with 3 guilty verdicts of a cop for the first time because a prosecution decided to humanize somebody who was murdered by a cop. And so every time we introduce circumstances that we've all been in and realize, why we sit outside of bars versus why we sit inside of bars and check our privilege on that, those stories are important. And thank you for telling them and always bringing them, because you have all the knowledge inside your head. You could recite a bunch of facts, but you're reciting stories.
You see, this is Liz. Until the next time.
Well, the next time, Dr. Goodwin, thank you so much. And we will be there soon. Please be well and take care of yourself. And I hope to see you soon, all vaccinated.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.